Today we're going to add breadcrumb functionality to the AI. So what that means is when we get within range of the enemy, he's going to start following the player. And as he's following the player, he's going to drop breadcrumbs along the way. And when we eventually get out of range of the enemy, he's going to turn and follow his breadcrumbs back to the point that he was at when he originally started following us. So I'll just show you that working here. You can see he starts dropping the breadcrumbs, and when I eventually run out of range, you see that the enemy turns and follows those breadcrumbs back to where he was, and then he'll continue to keep patrolling. So this was built on top of the last tutorial, which shows you how to get the waypoints set up. So I'd advise you to watch that video first. It's only about 15 minutes, and then you'll be able to follow along with this. So this is exactly where we left off the last tutorial. I'm just going to quickly make a couple of very small changes. So let's increase the size of that plane, and let's add a cylinder beneath each one of the waypoints. So these are going to have no real impact on the gameplay. This is just simply to make the waypoints a little bit easier to visualize when the game is actually in play mode. So I'm going to create a material here really quickly as well. We can just call this see-through. Make sure you set this to transparent and set it to whatever color that you want. Set it to yellow and make this a little bit see-through. Select all the cylinders, and then we're just going to drag that onto all those. So now we're just going to open up the waypoint script and continue to work on that. Okay, so again, this is exactly the way it was at the end of the last tutorial. So before we start, I'm just going to tidy up a couple of little things. While all this can theoretically remain in the update like this, it's just getting a little bit messy. So what I'm going to do is just going to create a function called update transform. And all we're going to do is move some of this into it. Okay, so this is just going to be responsible for updating rotation and position values. So we're just going to we'll take all of it for now and paste it in there. And what we're going to do is just take out this check distance line. We'll actually take out this one as well because we need that. So let's take out the two distance related lines. We'll just leave them in the update for now, and then we'll also call the update transform method as well. That's just a tiny little bit of tidy up. So the whole point of this tutorial is to create an enemy that does both the waypoint, goes around the waypoints, and also does the breadcrumbing as well. So dropping the breadcrumbs and then following those back and continuing to go around the waypoints afterwards. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a switch. So what we're going to do is create a function here first. We're just going to call that something like control enemy state, and in here we're going to create a switch that's going to take in a state. Okay, we haven't created this yet, and in here, depending on which state we're in, we're going to be doing some different checks. So let's go up and create this state first up the top. Okay, so I'm just going to create a region here called breadcrumb variables. Just end the region here, just so it's a little bit clearer to see which these variables are related to this current tutorial and which the other ones then will be related to the last one. So let's create an enum. Let's create an enum called enemy state, and in here we'll say that the enemy can be patrolling, the enemy can be following the player, and the enemy can be following the breadcrumbs. Okay, and this should be public. Oh God, I can't type. And let's just create a enemy state here then called state. Okay. So what we want to do is, let's actually just set this at the start. Let's set this state to patrolling at the start, okay, by default. So let's create a case then for each of these states. So if the enemy is patrolling, we're going to write code in here for when the enemy is patrolling. Let's create another one here for when the enemy is following the player, and let's create another one here for when the enemy is following the breadcrumbs. Okay, so now that we have the skeleton code kind of set up, I'm going to quickly just discuss how this is going to actually work. So the idea is we're going to have an enemy who's going to be at some point in the world. He's going to start following the player, and as he does that, he's going to start dropping these breadcrumbs at predefined increments, and eventually he's going to come to a point where he loses sight of the player, and then he needs to start traversing back through these breadcrumbs, using them to find his path back to where he was. So what we need to do for this obviously is we're going to need a breadcrumb prefab. We're going to need to know this distance of how often do we want to drop the breadcrumbs, and we're going to need a list or an array or something to hold the reference to the breadcrumbs that this enemy has dropped. So let's create some variables up the top that will be related to the breadcrumbs. We're going to start off by creating a list which will hold all the breadcrumbs. So this can just be a list of transforms. Let's just call this crumbs. Then we're going to need an actual object that we're going to use as the breadcrumbs. So let's just create a public game object. Let's call this crumb. Let's also create a public transform for the player. It's going to need a reference to know which player it's meant to follow. And let's also create a float for the distance that we want to leave between each crumb. So we'll just call this minimum crumb distance, and we can just set that to 3. And then let's just create another variable which is going to be called the last known waypoint. Okay, I'll get to this in a little bit, but this is going to be used for keeping allowing the enemy to keep track of which waypoint he was actually going towards when the player got close to him. So that'll become a little bit clear why we need that later on. So let's just hop back into Unity and actually populate some of those fields. So just wait a second for this to compile. Sorry, I never saved it. Make sure you save, go back, wait for this to compile. Then select the enemy. We'll see here that we need to create a crumb and we need to create a player. Okay, so let's do the crumb first. So all I'm going to do for the crumb is create a 3D object. Just create a sphere. Let's just take off the sphere collider and let's create a material really quickly. Material, make this whatever color you want. We're just going to make it green. Doesn't matter. And add that to the sphere. You can just rename this crumb and create a prefab out of it by dragging it into the project panel, and we can just delete that from the scene then. So reselect the enemy and let's just drag the crumb back onto that, and now let's create the player. So really quickly, let's just put in a cylinder, call this player. Put an icon over its head just so it's easier to see, and let's just add a move player script onto that. Let's open that in Visual Studio. Okay, so the whole point of this tutorial is to do the breadcrumbing, so I'm not going to go through this script. I'm just going to paste it in. It'll be in the description, or you can just copy it on the screen there. But that's the entire script. It's quite short, it's pretty basic. All it is moving the enemy, moving the player, I should say, in an up, down, left, right direction based on the arrow keys on the keyboard. So that's all it is. You can just copy that in. So let's come back into Unity. Just make sure that the script is on the player. Let's just move this game tab over here. And if you run this now, you should be able to move the player using the up, down, left, right arrow keys. And you'll notice that the enemy still won't interact with us because we haven't done any of that yet. But at least you can move the player now. So let's just stop that then and go in and look at creating the functionality to actually let the enemy drop the breadcrumbs and actually follow the player. So now we can actually write the code to actually drop a breadcrumb. So all we're going to be doing when we're dropping a breadcrumb is instantiating one of those crumb objects at the position that the enemy is currently at. So we can just create a game object called dropped crumb, and we can just instantiate the crumb object at the current position, and we don't want to give it any kind of fancy rotation, so we can just do quaternion.identity, and we don't want to give it a parent game object, so we can set that to null. And what we want to do then is add that to the crumbs list, because the crumbs list is a list of all the dropped breadcrumbs that this enemy has dropped. So every enemy is going to know is going to have a list of all the crumbs that they have dropped, and then when it comes to a time where they need to follow those crumbs back, well, then they can follow them back in quite an easy order. So what we're going to just do is add the dropped crumb and dot transform, because this crumbs is a list of transforms. So this is the dropping of the crumb actually done. So now we just need to figure out where that actually goes. So I mean, you can see in the control enemy state that we have this quite neatly broken out into when the enemy is following, when the enemy is patrolling, when the enemy is following the breadcrumbs. So right now we're dropping it here in the following player, which is correct, but we just need to do a little bit of work on that, because right now there's no way of actually getting into this following player state. So we set the state at the start where the enemy starts patrolling, but we don't give it a way that it can actually get into the following player state. So what we're going to do is create another function called check distance to player. Okay. Now, this could be done all within the different states in here, but just so this doesn't get all like really packed and congested, I'm just going to separate it out into a separate function. So in here we're going to do another switch. It's going to be pretty much the same as the one above, where it's going to take in the state, and depending on which state we're in, we're going to do different things. So we create a state for when the enemy is patrolling, create a state for when the enemy is following the player, and create a state for when the enemy is following the breadcrumbs. Okay, so the check distance to player. If you go back up and look at the check distance to the waypoint, we're only going to ever check that while we're in the patrolling state, okay? But we want to check the distance to the player at all times, because we're going to be doing different things based on that, whether we're patrolling, whether we're following the breadcrumbs, or whether we're following the player. So for example, while patrolling, we need to know the distance that that the enemy is from the player, because when the player gets too close, you need to start following them. When you're actually following the player, so when you're in the following player state, we need to know how far away the player can get from the enemy before the enemy is going to turn around and start following the breadcrumbs. And then while you're following the breadcrumbs, you need to be aware of the player still, because if the player gets too close to the enemy, well, we need to start following him again. So that's why you need to know about the distance from the player at all times. So let's just put a call to the check distance to player inside the enemy control state, distance to player, because this will be getting called in every update. Sorry, that should be getting called in every update. So sorry, can't type. Control enemy state will be getting called in every update. We're going to come into it. We're going to check the distance to the player at all times, and then we're going to do some additional checks depending on which state we're in here. Okay. So we need a way of actually getting into this following player state, because right now we're not telling the enemy how to actually get in to be able to drop these breadcrumbs. So let's go down here to the check distance to player method, and while we're patrolling, let's do a check to see how far we are from the player. Distance. So we want to do the distance between this enemy and the player, and if the player is closer than, let's say, 2 units away, then we'll consider the player to be in range. Okay, so what we'll do then when the player is in range is we'll set the state of this enemy to following the player. Okay, so at this point the enemy is going to change its state from patrolling to following the player. So that means he's going to start dropping breadcrumbs. But you'll see here, if I run this, he's just going to start dropping breadcrumbs straight away, which isn't exactly what we wanted to do. So you can see here that the enemy is right within range at the start, and he starts dropping breadcrumbs straight away. And obviously that isn't what we want to happen. So you'll also notice that the enemy didn't actually follow the player, he just started dropping breadcrumbs. So we need to do a little bit of work around when he's going to drop a breadcrumb. So what we'll do is, in this control enemy state function, in the following player section, we'll do a check. So we'll check to see if a crumb has already been dropped. Okay, so we'll see if the crumbs dot count is greater or equal to 1. So basically, if we've at least dropped a crumb, well then what we need to do is wait a little bit of time, or wait till we're far enough away from that crumb before we drop another one. So I pop back in here and I just draw this again. If you imagine the enemy is here at this point, he sees the player. The first thing he's going to do is drop a crumb exactly where he is. So then we want to wait until he moves a little bit before he drops another crumb, and so on like this until he gets to a point then where he's going to turn back and go back through the crumbs. So if we just go back in here, let's set that up here now. Okay, so let's just tidy this up a tiny bit here. So if we get inside this if loop, this means we have dropped the first crumb. Okay? If we haven't dropped the first crumb, well then we want to drop the first crumb straight away. So we're just going to put this drop breadcrumb call in here. Okay? So let's just go over that again. The second the enemy gets called into this following player state, that means that the player has just come in range down here. Okay, so we've been checking the distance to the player while patrolling. He's just come within range, so we've changed our state to following the player. We then come in here and we instantly check, have we dropped the crumb? We won't have dropped the crumb at this point, so we're going to drop the crumb straight away. And then it's going to come back up here and check and see if we've dropped the crumb. Then right here we're going to check to see if we should drop another crumb. Okay, so what we want to do is wait, like we just showed you there in Paint, wait until there's a little bit of distance between the enemy and where he dropped that crumb. So what we'll do is we'll create a function that tells us if we've moved far enough away. So let's just pop down here and create a function that will return a bool, and we'll just call this should place crumb. And this is going to determine whether or not the enemy should drop a crumb. So what we'll do is we'll just check the distance between the enemy and the last crumb in the crumbs list. So remember, every time a crumb is dropped, it's added to that list. So we'll just check the distance between the enemy and the last crumb. So that should be its transform that position, and we'll see if that is greater than whatever that minimum crumb distance is that we defined up the top. We're just going to return true, just telling the enemy that he does need to drop a crumb, and if not, it means that the enemy hasn't moved far enough away, so we'll return false, telling it that it doesn't need to drop a crumb yet. Okay, so now we need to just scroll up to where we're actually going to call this. So if we just replace this line here, or we just put it in under for now, where we do the check. So we'll do a check here where we call that method, and we check should we place a crumb, and if that will return true, well then this is where we're going to drop the breadcrumb then. So we're saying if this returns true, it means that we have moved far enough away, so we're going to drop a breadcrumb, and that's pretty much it. So if we just save that, and you see there that the enemy has dropped the breadcrumbs, but only when he's moved a little bit away from the last breadcrumb that's been dropped. So to make that a little bit more obvious, I'm just going to move the player at the start completely away from the enemy, so he's not in range. So you can see now he's just patrolling, so he's not in the following the player stage. And now when he gets really close to the player here, you see that he starts dropping the breadcrumbs, and they drop that increment that we defined. So let's just go back into the script now and get the enemy to actually start moving towards the player while he's dropping those breadcrumbs. So to do that, let's go back to the check player distance function. So you can see when the enemy is patrolling, we're doing the check to see if the player gets close, and if he does, we're telling him to start following the player. But just before we do that, then what we're going to do is we're going to set the target waypoint. Okay, so this is the waypoint. This is where the enemy is currently moving towards. We're just going to set that to be the player. Okay, so what's going to happen now is when the player gets close, so when we get into this loop, you're going to set the target that the player moves towards, or that the enemy moves towards, is going to be the player. And we're also going to change the state to the following player state, which means the breadcrumbs will start dropping. Okay, so let's just save that and run. Okay, so the enemy is going to start patrolling then, and when he gets close to the player, he's going to start going for the player, dropping the breadcrumbs. And you're not going to be able to actually get away from the player now, from the enemy, because, well, first of all, he's going too fast, and second of all, because we don't tell it to do anything when you move away. So let's just go back in and sort that out. So let's go move this back down to 3. And then let's go into where we're checking the distance again. Okay, so we're currently following the player, dropping the breadcrumbs as we're going along. Okay, so that's being done. So where am I now? That is being done here in the control enemy state. Okay, so this is where we're dropping the breadcrumbs, but we want to check the distance in the check distance to player. So while we're following the player here, what we want to do is we want to check if the distance from the enemy to the player is greater than, and let's just set it to 6 for now. Ooh, that should be player dot position. Is greater than 6. Well, then we're going to consider the player to have escaped the range of the enemy. Okay, so let's say player has escaped. Follow breadcrumbs. We'll say follow breadcrumbs back. Okay, so what we'll do here is we'll set the state to following breadcrumbs, and then we can define what we actually wanted to do and how we actually want to get the enemy to follow those breadcrumbs back. So let's have a look at what that actually looks like. So this is just an example of the scene with the 4 waypoints around the corners. So right now the enemy walks around the perimeter like this to each waypoint. Okay, so at any given time this enemy knows what his target waypoint is. So if he's walking this way, in this instance the target waypoint is going to be W2 because he's walking over here. So let's say the enemy is here when he sees the player. The first thing we need to do is take note of what the enemy's current waypoint is at that point, what his current target waypoint is, which would be W2, because as I said, the enemy would be, if the player didn't come in range, the enemy would be going this way. So we're just going to keep track of that the second that the player gets within range of the enemy. So if we just write that up here, we'll just call that the last known waypoint. In this case, it will be W2. So at this moment, when the enemy sees the player, the first thing it's going to do is drop a breadcrumb straight away, okay? Because this is the spot that it's going to return to once the player gets out of range. So the enemy will start going towards the player, dropping breadcrumbs, following the player until he eventually loses sight. So let's say he loses sight of the player up here. So at this point, the enemy loses sight of the player, and now what we want to make him do is go back through all of these breadcrumbs until he gets back. So what we want to do is tell the enemy to go from where he is to the last breadcrumb. When he gets there, we're going to delete this breadcrumb. Then we're going to go to the position of the second last breadcrumb. Then we're going to go like this the whole way until eventually we get back to exactly where the enemy was at the start. So remember, as the enemy is walking, following the player, he's dropping all these breadcrumbs and adding them to an array. So we can simply go to the last element of the array here. That's what we'll do. Then we will delete it. Then we will go to what is now the last element in the array, which is this one, and then we can delete that once we reach it, and so on until eventually there are no breadcrumbs left, because we keep removing the breadcrumbs once we reach them, because there's no point in leaving them there. And eventually we'll get back to the starting position, and what we can do then is have a look at what was the last known waypoint, in which case in this instance would be over here, and then we can just tell the enemy to continue on walking towards that waypoint. So that's pretty much what we're going to do, but there is one little change that we're going to make to that. In the case that the enemy is going back through this exact path, when we get to here, we're going to go from that one to this one. Then once we get to here, we're close to the waypoint here. We're already close to it. So there's no point in making the enemy walk the whole way back this way, the whole way back through all these breadcrumbs, just to make him then walk instantly back to go straight to this waypoint that he's already passed. So we're going to do a check when we get to each breadcrumb to see if the distance for the enemy to move to the next breadcrumb is greater than the distance it would take him to go to his last known waypoint. And if it is shorter to go to the last known waypoint than it is to go to the next breadcrumb, well then we're just going to make him forget about the rest of the breadcrumbs and go to the waypoint. So what that would look like is this. The enemy is here when he loses sight of the player. So he goes back to this breadcrumb. We then do a check and see, is this breadcrumb here, is it a shorter distance for the enemy to go to this breadcrumb or to go to the second waypoint here? It's obviously going to be closer for the enemy to go to here, so we'll make him go to here. Then we'll do the same check when we want to move to here. It'll obviously be shorter if the enemy is now at this position. Where's my little tool? If the enemy is now at this position, it'll obviously be shorter to move to this breadcrumb than it will be to get to here, so we'll move him to here. So now the enemy is going to be at this position, and we can check, is it going to be shorter to move from here to here or here to here? It's going to be shorter to get to here, so we'll move him to that position. Now at this point, the enemy is going to be about here, and we're going to do a check and see, is it going to be shorter to move from here to here or from here to the last known waypoint, which is here. So it would be this. And in this case, it's going to be closer to just go straight to this waypoint. So what we're going to tell the enemy to do is to forget about all of these, forget about all of those, and just go straight to here. So the enemy will, instead of having his path, which would have looked like this, which would originally look from this, from around up here and gone through all these waypoints, back to here, and back down. Instead of doing that, he's actually going to go from here straight to this waypoint like this. And then he'll continue on as is. So let's create a method called return to starting point. And this is going to be called every time that the enemy is following the breadcrumbs, okay? So let's say called when the enemy is following breadcrumbs. Okay, so obviously for the enemy to follow breadcrumbs, there has to be at least one breadcrumb there to follow. So the first thing we're going to do is just do a check to see that there are crumbs in the scene that the enemy has dropped. Okay, so let's check that there's at least one in the scene. Okay, so there are still crumbs left to follow. And if there are, what we want to do is get a reference to that last crumb, and we can do that by accessing the crumbs list and just getting the length of that and taking the last entry in that list. Okay, so once we have a reference to this last crumb, all we're going to do is set the target waypoint to be equal to that last crumb. Okay, so when we come in here, when the enemy starts following the waypoints, it'll call this method. It will come in here, see that there are crumbs left to follow. It will get the last crumb in the list and set that to be its target waypoint, and that's when it'll start moving towards. That's when it'll start moving towards that. So now what we need to do is when the enemy reaches a breadcrumb, we need to then get rid of that breadcrumb. Okay, because remember up here we're always checking for the last breadcrumb and setting that as the target. So when we reach a breadcrumb, we need to get rid of that breadcrumb. So then the next time that we come in and do this check is going to get the next breadcrumb in the list. So let's just do a check here. We go if the distance between the enemy's position and the target waypoint, which is going to be the last crumb, is less than, let's just say 0.3, something really small, then we'll consider him to have reached, this is where he's reached the waypoint, okay? He's reached the, let's call it the breadcrumb, reached the breadcrumb. So what we want to do then is remove that breadcrumb, remove whatever this last crumb is, because we've reached it, so we don't need it anymore. We've removed it from the list. Now we're just going to destroy it from the actual world, otherwise it would be left there and there's no need to leave it in the scene. And then we're going to call this function again. So we're going to call this function that we're currently writing, okay? So we're going to get to a breadcrumb, we're going to get rid of it, we're going to call this function again, come back in, we're going to make sure there's still breadcrumbs left, and then we're going to get what is the new last crumb, and we're going to do all this again, okay? So what we want to do then is we want to account for when there are no crumbs left. So all this is run when there are still crumbs, but obviously we're going to get to a point then where there are no crumbs left. And at that point, all we want to do is set the state back to patrolling, because now we've gone back through all these. We want to just start patrolling again. And what we'll just really quickly do as well is set the target waypoint to be the last known waypoint. Okay. Now, obviously, we haven't recorded this anywhere yet, so we need to account for that now. When we are following the player, when the player gets far enough away that we lose track of him, that's when we set our state to following the breadcrumbs. But just before we do that, we want to set our last known waypoint to be equal to the target waypoint that at that moment he's currently going towards. So what will happen is the player gets away, we record the last known waypoint, we start following the breadcrumbs, then when we come in here, we start following all the breadcrumbs that we've left. So we go to the very last crumb, we check to see if we've reached it. When we do, we get rid of that crumb and we call this function again. We keep going through here until eventually there are no crumbs left. Then what we do is we go back to patrolling and we check what that last known waypoint is. I set that as the target. Okay, so it's almost done. There's just one more change that we actually need to make to that. So we need to keep track of this last known waypoint, and we need to do that just when the player is about to start following, just when the enemy is about to start following the player. So we can do that up here. So this is when the enemy just comes within range, and we're just about to change to start following the player. And just before we do that, we want to just keep track of the last known waypoint. Okay, so we're just going to keep track of that. So the last known waypoint is going to be the target that we were just going to before the player came into range. So we keep track of that there. So now we need to actually call this method, because we haven't called this anywhere. So where we've just made this change here, you can see that we just changed the state to following the player. In the following player state, when the enemy and the player get far enough away from each other, we're going to consider the player to have escaped. And then we change the state to following breadcrumbs. So in here, this is where, sorry, not in here, up here then, in our control enemy state, this is where we actually want to put the code in here to tell it what to do while following the breadcrumbs. And all we're going to do is tell it to keep calling the return to starting point. So it's going to keep calling that while it's in that state. It's going to keep calling this method again until there are no crumbs left. It'll keep cycling it through. When there's eventually no crumbs left, it's going to start going back to its last known waypoints. So it's a pretty small change. All we need to do is come back into this function where the enemy is going back through all the waypoints and through all the breadcrumbs. And what we want to do is just do a check here and check to see if the distance from the enemy to the breadcrumb is further than the distance to the last known waypoint. And if the last known waypoint is closer, well, then we're just going to tell them to go to the last known waypoint. So we'll just do a check here again where we check to see if the enemy's position to the last known waypoint position is less than the distance from the enemy, from the enemy to the last, sorry, not to the last crumb. We can actually just say to the target waypoint position. And that's because we set the last crumb to be the target waypoint here. So we can just do that. Okay? And if that is, so if it is a shorter distance to go to the last waypoint, what we're going to do is set the target waypoint to be the last known waypoint. We're then going to change the state to be patrolling, because now we're forgetting about following the breadcrumbs. We're just going to start patrolling again. And then just to do some tidy up, we're just going to go through all the breadcrumbs that are left in the crumbs list. We can actually just call this breadcrumbs to make it a little bit easier. So for all the breadcrumbs that are left in that list, we want to just destroy. So I should really call that breadcrumb singular. We want to destroy that. We just want to destroy that game object. Okay, so that way they'll get rid of all them out of our scene. And just to tidy up the list, then we'll just clear that list as well, just so there's no way that there can be any remaining breadcrumbs in that list, because then that would mess it up the next time that this enemy wants to drop breadcrumbs. Okay, so just to go over that again, it's just going to do a quick check to see, is the distance from the enemy to the last known waypoint less than the distance from the enemy to the waypoint it's going to, which would be the last crumb in this case. And if it is shorter to get to the last known waypoint, well then we set that as the target. We start patrolling again, and then we just go through all the breadcrumbs that are left in this enemy's crumbs list, and we just delete them, and then we just clear the list as well. So let's have a look at how that looks. Okay, so we'll see that the enemy is getting close to this waypoint here. This is the one he's going towards, so we're going to bring him past it. Okay, so now the fact that this is his last known waypoint means that when he gets close enough to it, he'll forget about the remaining breadcrumbs. Okay, so we'll test that out with this one here as well. So he's currently going towards this waypoint 2 here. So if we were to bring him on a big long route here and go over this way, eventually when he gets close enough to this, he will forget about all those remaining breadcrumbs. So there is one problem with this, and let me show you that now. So while the enemy is following all these breadcrumbs, if we lose track of him, and now if I cross his path again while he's following those breadcrumbs, he's not going to do anything until he reaches the end. It's only then will he start following again. So that's because we haven't put in a check for when the player gets within distance of the enemy while he is in that following breadcrumbs phase. So if we go up here to this function here, we are not checking anything from the distance of the player while we're following the breadcrumbs. So we need to add that in here. It's going to be very similar to how we're doing it up here in the patrolling. So what we need to do is, while following breadcrumbs, let's check to see if the player is in range. So if the distance from this enemy to the player is less than, and we'll use 2 again. And in a second, we'll go up and create variables for these in a second, because we shouldn't have all these numbers here. So if the player is in range, what we want to do is set the target waypoint to be the player, and we want to change the state to be following the player. And that's pretty much it. So now we can go ahead and have a look at that. And now when we get within range of the enemy, he will start following us. And if we bring him on a bit of a trek, and once we get out of range, when he's following those breadcrumbs, if we get him within range again, he's going to keep following us again. Okay, and then he'll just go back through the list again, the list of waypoints of breadcrumbs, until he gets to the end, and we can cross his path as much as we want, and he'll keep just going back and following those breadcrumbs until he gets back on track and starts patrolling again. So that's pretty much it. All that's left to do is a few little tidy up things. So we can go in and create some variables for these numbers here. So we need one for when the player is in range. So let's just call that private float in range. Let's set that to 2. Let's create another one for when the player escapes. So let's call that escape distance. And that was set to 6. And let's just go down and replace those down in the code here. So this now becomes in range. This becomes escape distance. And this becomes in range as well. Not instantiate, this becomes in range. Okay. So there's definitely other tidy up that can be done. So for example, a lot of this could be put into this one switch statement up here. The only reason I didn't put it in here is just to keep the it kind of separated for pretty much just ease of reading in the tutorial really. All this is related to distance, so it kind of made sense to put that in a function that deals just with distance, and then this is to do with you know, the actual functionality, the different functionality that we do in each stage. So for example, dropping the breadcrumbs while in the following player stage, and calling this function while in the following breadcrumb stage. So the last thing to do then is to really just come in and add the bubble to this, so we can really see when we're actually in range of this player, of the enemy. So just select the enemy, just add a sphere. Let's make this 4, 4, 4, and the reason that's 4 is because we've set the distance in here, the range, to be 2. So if that's 2, well then that means by having this at 4, we have 2 at in each direction from the center of this sphere. So let's just use the same material that we put on the waypoints and drag that onto the sphere, and that's your bubble. Okay. So again, we can just run that just to have one last look. Enemies patrolling. Drop his breadcrumbs if we come in range. When we get out of range, he'll start following the breadcrumbs. So that's pretty much it.